My name is Mara Ellison, 30 years old. The night my family wrapped a paper banner across the living room that read, Happy 80th, the house looked exactly like the memory I'd been rewriting for a decade. Soft lamplight, Mom's tulips balanced in blue mason jars, the old slideshow humming on Dad's laptop, while Grandpa's photos dissolved into each other like long breaths. The porch still creaked in the same places. The air still smelled like cut grass and lighter fluid from an afternoon barbecue. And for a few minutes, I let it hold me, the way a borrowed coat still carries the old owner's warmth. Jake didn't let it hold him. He stood beside me with that steady posture I used to mistake for calm and now understood as calculation. His fingers laced with mine, casual for anyone watching, but the tendons in his hand told a different story. "Mara," he murmured, smile fixed, eyes circulating. "Grab your bag." I tilted my head, half amused. "For what? We just got here." He didn't laugh. His voice dropped, the pitch he uses when he's a soldier and not my husband. "Don't ask, just smile." I did the thing you do when you want to pretend you're not afraid. I made a joke on the way to the kitchen, greeting my cousin Patty as she balanced a plate of pie. "You two sneaking off already?" she called. "Never miss dessert," Jake answered, light and polite, while his other hand guided me past the swinging door. The instant it shut, his whole body hardened. He looked out through the window over the sink toward the driveway. "Two men by the shed, both on earpieces," he said softly. "Black SUV across the street's been idling 10 minutes. Lights off. And someone just signaled through the kitchen window twice." I tried to laugh again and couldn't find the air. "Maybe there's security. Maybe Dad hired—" "Neighbors don't use sweep patterns," he said, even softer. "I've seen it before." The slideshow hid a photo of Grandpa in dress whites, saluting with 3 other sailors. Light pulsed off the screen, blinking across the doorway like a coded message. I looked through to the living room. Dad hovered near the projector, telling a joke with his hands, Mom migrating from guest to guest with the same brittle kindness she wore like a brooch. Grandpa sat small and proud in his recliner, medals shining on his chest, a frosting smear on his knuckle where someone had pressed his finger into the cake. When his eyes flicked to mine, they didn't quite focus. A small, cold thing unfolded in my stomach. Jake leaned closer, almost smiling, in case anybody glanced in. "This isn't a birthday," he whispered. "It's an operation." My mouth went dry. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer right away. He moved instead, decisive, unhurried, opening the side door that led down the steps to the gravel. "If I'm wrong, I'll apologize later," he said. "If I'm right, we don't want to be in the blast radius." The night had that Iowa gold to it, the last of the sunlight stretching long across the fields. The air tasted like rain that hadn't decided yet. We walked to the car like we were leaving early to relieve a babysitter we didn't have. He opened my door, waited for the interior light to die, then slid behind the wheel and didn't start the engine. In the rear view, the porch framed the party like a stage. Grandpa lifted a paper cup as Dad's voice swelled over a story from the old days on the ship. "You said your dad manages Grandpa's benefits," Jake said, eyes on the mirror. "He files the VA paperwork, yeah," I said. "Why?" He inhaled slowly. "Because if anyone's been moving money under your grandfather's ID, tonight would be the night they push the last signature." A metallic clink rang from behind us, the sharp, neat sound of a car door closing softly. Jake unlocked his phone with his thumb and tapped twice. He didn't raise his voice. "If I'm wrong, nobody gets embarrassed," he said. "If I'm right, the MPs will." The letters hit my ears like a dropped tray. "The MPs?" I whispered. "What did you—" He put the car in gear, turned onto the road, and eased us down a 1/4 mile, parking behind the old corn silo. The world went very quiet. In that silence, you could hear the lie the house was telling. We waited. The slideshow glow flickered and died. Crickets chirped like a metronome you don't notice until it stops. Then, like someone yanked a curtain, the dark lit up red and blue. Sirens rose and fell, sharp, controlled, none of the messy panic of TV. We both stared at the farmhouse. Two men stepped onto the porch in dark jackets and spoke into their sleeves. Another pair moved toward the kitchen entrance. I thought of Grandpa's unfocused eyes, the frosting smear, and suddenly saw it. Not age, not fatigue, but gentle sedation. My throat burned. "Oh my God," I said without realizing I'd said it. They waved us forward minutes later. The yard looked like theater after a power outage, balloons tilting, cake plates abandoned, chairs at angles they didn't belong. An MP addressed Jake first. The way he nodded back made me feel both safer and lonelier. Then I saw my father. He came down the steps with his hands out and his voice pitched just right for the neighbors who'd notice. "This is insane," he said to me, not to them, his eyes grabbing mine like a handle. "Tell them, Mara. Tell them it's a birthday." An MP slid between us, firm but not cruel. "Ma'am, please step back." Mom appeared in the porch light, mascara feathering at the corners of her eyes, lipstick smudged like a hurried decision. She didn't look at me first. She looked at Jake. "What did you do?" she asked, voice small and sharp. "You've ruined everything." Jake didn't flinch. "Ma'am, your husband is being questioned under Title 38. I suggest you cooperate." The words didn't even echo. They just landed and sank. Mom's mouth opened, then shut. She swallowed something I couldn't see. In the kitchen, somebody had set down a half-empty glass of punch beside a prescription bottle that wasn't Grandpa's usual. Powder dust lined the cutting board. A paper, slick with condensation, stuck to the counter like it had been smoothed open and forgotten in a hurry. I recognized my father's handwriting before I processed the header. Authorization, active case. The letters looked official enough to create belief and flexible enough to invite abuse. Only one line was signed. The second line, the one under Grandpa's printed name, was blank, a pen trail hovering just short of contact, like someone had steadied his hand and then been interrupted. I told myself it was a misunderstanding, the way you tell yourself the thunder is far away, even as you count the seconds and get the wrong number. In the doorway, just past the frame, Dad's friend Doug hovered with a paper plate. He wasn't eating. He wasn't blinking much either. When the sirens had hit earlier, he'd vanished behind the crowd, and I'd felt his absence like a missing rung on a ladder. Now he watched the countertop like it had betrayed him. When he finally noticed me noticing him, he looked down at his shoes and made a performance of wiping barbecue sauce off his thumb. Jake's voice came from behind me, steady and clinical for the benefit of the recorder I couldn't see. He spoke to the MP nearest the sink. "Crushed residue, wrong dosage for someone his age," he said. "Kitchen prep surface used for mixing." I stared at the pill bottle. The label listed a sedative I recognized from Grandpa's post-surgery years, the one that made him call me by Mom's name and then apologize for it with tears he'd never let me see when I was little. "He looked empty," I said, to no one and everyone. "During the slideshow, like he kept losing where he was." The MP jotted notes. Mom must have seen the direction of my gaze because she stepped forward like she could stand between me and the truth if she moved fast enough. "He gets anxious," she said quickly, then softer, as if coaxing me back into the old script. "You know how he gets when there's too much commotion, honey." Honey. I hadn't been honey in a long time. The word tugged at me, but the tug didn't move anything. In Dad's office, the cabinet door hung just slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry or never learned how to close things all the way. Inside, neatly misfiled, a folder wore the same label as the paper on the counter. Authorization, active case. The top tab bore a sticky note in Mom's handwriting, the soft loops unmistakable. Signature final? A question mark like a mercy she couldn't afford. I didn't touch anything. I just stood in the doorway and felt the house shift under the weight of a story I hadn't been invited to. They took statements. They took Grandpa too, for observation, a phrase that felt like a sheet pulled over a wound you weren't ready to look at. Dad said very little. He practiced silence like he'd been rehearsing in the mirror. When they finally let him inside, pending the next step of the investigation, he passed me in the hall and paused, not quite turning. "You know why I manage the paperwork, Mara?" he asked in a voice that wasn't for the report. Because I'm the one who shows up. I opened my mouth, but he was already moving again. Outside, beneath the exhale of an engine that refused to cut off, Jake stood with the MP who'd first met us at the road. He came back to me with that care he uses when he knows the next sentence will become a hinge in the door you can't close later. If I'm wrong, he said gently, I'll apologize to everyone in the room. He looked past me toward the kitchen, the counter, the faint dust on the cutting board that would glow if you hit it with the right light. But if I'm right, he added, and his hand found mine, it's not just pension skimming. I didn't sleep the night the military police cleared out. I sat in the motel armchair while the hum of the mini-fridge pretended to be calm. The paper Jake had shown me, the authorization form with Grandpa's name half-signed, lay across my knees like a wound that still leaked light. At dawn, Jake finished typing on his laptop, the glow cutting a thin silver line across his jaw. They'll want statements, he said quietly. NCIS is opening a file. It's bigger than we thought. I stared at the carpet pattern, a repeating maze that never connected. You think my parents were laundering benefits? Not just benefits. He turned the screen toward me, a chart of transfers, columns of amounts that looked small individually and horrifying in sequence. These are survivor fund disbursements from the VA. Every few months, 2,000-3,000 at a time, rerouted into a holding account in Des Moines. My throat tightened. Dad's signature? On all of them, Jake said, electronic, verified. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, the way he did after long deployments when the world still felt like a briefing room. They didn't invent the scheme, he added. Someone gave them a template. Who? That's what NCIS wants to know. When we got to the hospital later that morning, Grandpa looked smaller beneath the starched white sheets, but his eyes were awake again, clear and sharp as winter air. His voice rasped, half whisper, half gravel. You came. Of course, I said, taking his hand. You scared us. He smiled faintly. That's my job, isn't it? Jake lingered at the foot of the bed, posture crisp even in jeans. Grandpa studied him for a beat, then said, Navy, right? Jake nodded. SEALs. I thought so. You've got that watch the door energy. The old man's humor dissolved into a sigh. Heard some of what happened. Guess it wasn't much of a birthday. No, sir, Jake said. But you're safe now. Grandpa looked between us, his gaze catching on the file folder Jake carried. Your father in trouble? Jake didn't answer. I did. They're questioning him. Grandpa's eyes went distant, like he was seeing something on a horizon only he recognized. He's been under pressure, doesn't excuse it, but pressure cracks men in predictable places. The door opened and Mom stepped in, mascara washed off, hair unpinned. For the first time in years, she looked her age. They said I could visit, she whispered. Grandpa turned his face toward the window. The light off the IV stand hit his medals where they hung on the chair beside him, a shimmer of old honor. Dad's talking to a lawyer, Mom said, looking at me now. They're saying it's a misunderstanding, paperwork mix-up. I heard the brittle edge in her voice, the way guilt disguises itself as exhaustion. Mom, the pills, the bottle, doctor's orders, she interrupted too fast. He gets anxious. Jake's tone was soft but surgical. The dosage was 4 times what a doctor would prescribe for someone his weight. Mom flinched. You went through our kitchen? Your husband left the evidence on the counter, Jake said evenly. I didn't need to go through anything. For a moment, I thought she might slap him. Instead, her shoulders dropped and she whispered, You don't understand what it's like watching someone fade. You do what you have to. Grandpa's voice cut the air. Drugging me for a signature isn't care, Helen. She covered her face, and for the first time since the raid, I saw her shake. The sound wasn't anger. It was the small, terrified sob of someone who knows the line between loyalty and crime disappeared months ago. The nurse entered with a clipboard, giving us an excuse to breathe. After she left, Jake pulled me aside into the hallway. NCIS liaisons on a video call in 10, he said. They found metadata linking your father's submissions to an internal VA login, someone on the inside approving the transfers. An accomplice. Exactly. In the waiting room, sunlight cut through blinds, stripes across the posters that read, Serve those who served. Jake's laptop pinged. The NCIS agent appeared, gray suit, face half pixelated by weak Wi-Fi. Petty Officer Ellison, he greeted out of habit before catching himself. Mr. Ellison, rather. We've reviewed the files you sent. The funds moved through a shell company registered under a rehabilitation research project. Codename Harlo. Ring any bells? Jake frowned. Harlo? Not an active project. It was. 1980s. Veterans trauma recovery. Some records sealed under national security due to experimental protocols. So, classified medical data, Jake said. Correct. Whoever's using your father's credentials may be accessing those accounts as if they were routine benefit payments. That's felony misuse of restricted government funds. The agent's eyes flicked toward me. Mrs. Ellison, we'll need your statement. Your proximity gives you insight into intent. My parents' intent? Yes. I almost laughed, the kind of laugh that shatters on contact. They didn't mean to betray a country, I said quietly. Just their family. The agent's voice softened a fraction. Sometimes that's how it starts. When the call ended, Jake closed the lid slowly, as if sealing a vault. Harlo changes everything, he said. If they touch those files, could they really face prison? He nodded. Federal. Minimum 5 years, maybe more. Depends on whether NCIS finds a sail trail. We drove back to the motel in silence. Outside, Iowa stretched flat and endless. Sky the color of washed aluminum. At a red light, Jake said, You still think I overreacted yesterday? I looked at him, at the exhaustion under his eyes. No, I said. You reacted exactly right. That night, I dreamed of the slideshow again. Grandpa's image blinking between slides. But instead of medals, he wore blank ID tags stamped with numbers. Every time Dad clicked the next frame, the numbers changed. When I woke, my cheeks were wet and Jake was already on the phone. Yeah, he said into the receiver, pacing. Title 38, subsection 6101, fraud involving veteran benefits. I'll send the chain of custody photos. He met my eyes as he hung up. They're moving fast. Expect interviews tomorrow. I pulled the thin motel blanket tighter. What happens to Grandpa? He's stable. They'll keep him under observation until the sedatives clear. By mid-morning, reporters were already calling the farmhouse. One left a voicemail on my old cell. This is KCR 9. Can we get a statement about the veteran fraud arrest? Arrest. The word stuck. Jake played it once, then deleted it. They move fast when there's blood in the water, he muttered. At lunch, Mom called. I almost didn't answer. Her voice sounded brittle, as if the air itself cut her throat. They're saying terrible things on TV, she said. Your father's a good man. He made mistakes. I wanted to scream. Mistakes don't involve forged signatures. Instead, I asked, Did you know? A pause. Then, I knew he was trying to fix things. How, Mom? By stealing from Grandpa? He meant to pay it back, she said quickly, before anyone noticed. Jake listened from across the room, expression unreadable. When I hung up, he said, That's the script. They'll cling to it until the evidence corners them. She sounded small. She sounded guilty, he corrected. That evening, we went back to the hospital. Grandpa was sitting upright, a newspaper folded on his lap. The headline read, Veteran Fraud Investigation in Cedar Grove. He glanced at me over the rim of his glasses. They spelled my name right, he said dryly. I tried to smile. Grandpa, he raised a hand. Don't apologize for what you didn't do. I served 40 years ago for the idea that truth matters. If the truth hurts, it's still truth. Jake approached the bed with the folder again. Sir, there's more. Grandpa's brow furrowed. More? Jake hesitated. The withdrawals weren't just pension funds. They were tied to those old Navy research accounts. Someone's been using your ID to access restricted projects. Grandpa's jaw set. Selling my service for profit. Yes, sir? The silence that followed felt like church. Grandpa finally said, Then the Navy will have its justice. But what about family? Jake glanced at me, letting me answer. I don't know, I whispered. I think we lost that. Grandpa's eyes softened. No, sweetheart. Family's just truth that survives the fire. When we stepped into the hallway, Jake's phone buzzed again. The NCIS agent's voice came through urgent, clipped. Mr. Ellison, confirm this. Your father-in-law's email alias shows forwarded files labeled Harlo Ref Q2. If those contain patient data, it's no longer fraud. It's a security breach. Jake's face went still. Meaning? Meaning espionage charges are on the table. The call cut out. For a long time, we didn't speak. Through the glass wall of the recovery room, Grandpa's reflection overlapped mine. His monitor beeped steadily, truth alive and measurable. Jake finally said, "This just got dangerous." I nodded, hearing my own heartbeat against the sterile air. For them? He met my eyes. For all of us. By the time the headlines reached our phones, it wasn't just a case file anymore. It was a scandal with a heartbeat. Veterans fraud probe widens in Cedar Grove. Local family under investigation for federal misuse of funds. My parents' names were in the second paragraph. My grandfather's was in the title. Reporters parked on the gravel road outside the farmhouse, the same driveway where I learned to ride my bike at 7. Their camera lights blinked through the fog like distant lightning. I watched it from the motel window and felt something deep inside me split. The kind of tear that doesn't bleed, just empties. Jake was sitting on the bed, scrolling through news alerts, his face unreadable. "They're not using your name," he said finally. "Not yet." "Yet," I echoed, because I knew how stories worked. People didn't want nuance. They wanted villains. Mom called that afternoon. I almost let it ring out, but guilt answered for me. "Mara," she said softly. Her voice trembled, not from fear but from control, like she was working hard to sound calm. "They're twisting things. Your father's devastated." "Devastated?" I repeated. "Mom, they found authorization forms in your kitchen. Grandpa was sedated for a signature." She hesitated. "He was anxious. He didn't always remember things." "Because someone was drugging him." The words came out louder than I intended. She fell silent. Then quietly, "We just wanted to make sure he didn't lose everything he'd worked for. The government takes advantage of veterans every day, Mara. We were only taking back what was ours." There it was, the self-justification, smooth as practiced piano keys. "Does Dad know about Harlo?" I asked. "What's that?" she said too quickly. "Some project I don't—" "Mom," I cut in, "you're in deeper than you think." She didn't respond, just exhaled like someone watching a bridge burn from both sides. "Tell Jake to stop sending things," she said finally. "You don't know what you're getting into." Then she hung up. Jake looked up from his laptop. What did she say? That we should stop. He gave a humorless half smile. That means we're close. By evening, local news trucks were stationed outside the hospital. The word fraud crawled across the bottom of the TV screen in every diner in town. When Jake and I walked into the VA building to check on Grandpa, people stared. The receptionist, a woman with kind eyes, looked at me the way people look at a family after a car wreck. Sympathy edged with relief that it wasn't them. Grandpa was awake, reading the paper again. "Did you see this?" he asked, tapping the headline. "Yes," I said quietly. "I'm sorry." He folded the paper neatly, aligning the corners. "For what? You didn't sign anything." "They're saying awful things about you." He gave a dry laugh. "They've said worse about better men." Jake stood near the window, phone in hand. "NCIS is confirming new subpoenas," he said. "They want your father's devices, Helen's too." Grandpa's expression darkened at Mom's name. "She used to sing hymns while doing dishes," he murmured. "Now she hums lies." I didn't know what to say, so I just sat beside him, tracing the creases on his hand. "They'll ask me to testify," I said. "The agent said I'll be subpoenaed." "Then you tell the truth," Grandpa said simply. "Even if it destroys them?" He turned his palm upward, catching my hand in his. "Truth doesn't destroy people, Mara. It reveals who they already were." That night, the motel walls felt thinner than paper. Rain hit the windows like small, relentless fingers. Jake was on another call with the liaison. I listened to the muted fragments. Internal logins at the VA. 3 accounts cross-linked. Possible data sale overseas. When he hung up, his voice was quiet. They're considering espionage charges if the Harlo files were transmitted. I swallowed. Espionage? Jake, that's prison. He nodded. Yeah. I turned away from the window. I keep thinking maybe Dad didn't mean to cross the line. Maybe he thought he was fixing some bureaucratic injustice. That's how he always saw himself, the guy fighting red tape. Jake sat beside me. Intent doesn't erase damage. Sometimes it makes it worse. You think he did it? I think he convinced himself it wasn't wrong. We sat in silence, the kind of silence that feels crowded. After a while, Jake said, "If they subpoena you, don't wait for them. Go willingly. It'll show good faith." Good faith? I whispered. To testify against my own parents? He met my eyes. To tell the truth before someone else tells it for you. 2 days later, the subpoena arrived. White envelope, bold black lettering. United States District Court. Inside, neat as a knife, my name. Jake placed a hand on my shoulder. You don't have to be afraid. I'm not afraid, I said. I'm ashamed. He squeezed once, then let go. You shouldn't be. You didn't choose this. But I chose silence, I murmured. All those years, I pretended their perfection wasn't a performance. Maybe that's complicity too. That night, I dreamed of my childhood kitchen. Mom stood at the counter, humming hymns again, but every word came out backward. Dad sat at the table, writing in loops that turned into $signs. Grandpa tried to speak, but his mouth filled with salt water. When I woke, my pillow was wet and the rain outside had stopped. The next morning, Jake drove us to the courthouse for the preliminary hearing. The town square looked the same as it had during high school parades, only now the flags hung limp in the gray wind. We passed Patty on the sidewalk. She lowered her coffee and muttered, "Heard about your folks." Her tone carried pity and curiosity in equal measure. Inside the courthouse, marble floors echoed every footstep. I waited on a bench while Jake checked in with the prosecutor. Across the hall, Dad's lawyer adjusted his tie, the kind of man who smelled like dry cleaning and confidence. When Dad walked in, handcuffed but composed, he scanned the room until he found me. For a fraction of a second, I saw the father who taught me to parallel park, who built birdhouses in the garage, who cried at my college graduation. Then the guard led him past, and that man disappeared. Mom trailed behind him, not in cuffs, just small and pale. She didn't look at me until the bailiff called her name. Then her eyes lifted, full of something between apology and accusation. The moment felt endless, suspended in a silence too fragile to touch. Jake returned with a folder. You ready? No, I said honestly, but I'll go anyway. The prosecutor, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady voice, explained what would happen. I would testify in the next session, confirm my observations from the night of the party, verify the evidence Jake had provided. We need to establish intent, she said. Your testimony will help. I nodded, my throat tight. He's still my father. She softened just slightly. Then tell the truth in a way he'd recognize, if he still can. That evening, we visited Grandpa again. The TV in his room was tuned to the local station, replaying the same headlines. He turned the volume down. Don't watch that noise, he said. They'll call everyone a hero or a criminal before they know the facts. I sat on the edge of his bed. They called you a victim. He smiled faintly. That's better than being forgotten. Jake leaned against the wall, arms crossed. They're finalizing charges. Grandpa looked from him to me. So it's really happening. Yes, I said. I testify tomorrow. He nodded, expression unreadable. Good. Truth needs witnesses. Then softer. Don't hate your mother, Mara. She didn't start this. She just forgot how to stop it. When he said that, I saw her differently, not as an accomplice, but as someone who mistook silence for love. Outside, night had fallen hard and clear. The courthouse lights glowed in the distance like a warning and a promise. Jake reached for my hand. You okay? I nodded, though I wasn't. If I tell the truth, they'll go to prison. He squeezed my hand gently. If you don't, you'll live in one. We walked toward the car, headlights reflecting off wet pavement. The wind carried the faint hum of church bells from downtown, the kind that always played before Sunday service. It was Thursday. The irony made me laugh once, quiet, broken, almost free. Tomorrow, I would sit under oath and speak the words that would fracture what was left of my family. And somewhere deep down, I prayed that the truth, once spoken, might finally start to heal what the lies had poisoned. The morning of my testimony smelled like rain and old paper. The courthouse steps glistened, slick from the storm that had passed just before dawn. Jake's hand was steady on my back as we climbed, but I could feel the tremor in his fingers, the kind that hides in people who pretend they're not afraid. Inside, the air was too cold, the lighting too bright. It felt like the building itself had been designed to keep people uncomfortable, to make them speak the truth out of sheer exhaustion. Reporters lined the hallway, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. I caught snippets: granddaughter turned witness, betrayal within a veteran's family, espionage probe expands. I kept my eyes on the floor until we reached the double doors of the courtroom. Jake paused, his voice low. "They'll try to rattle you. Just answer what's asked. Don't defend what can't be defended." I nodded. "And if he looks at me?" "Then look back," he said. "You deserve to." When I stepped inside, the sound died. The shuffle of papers, the creak of chairs, all of it fading into that strange vacuum that swallows the world right before something permanent happens. Dad sat at the defense table in a navy suit that looked borrowed, cuffs too long, eyes darker than I remembered. Mom was behind him, hands clasped tight enough to whiten the knuckles. When she noticed me, she half rose, then sat again, like apology had become a reflex her body couldn't complete. The judge entered, voice echoing through the wood-paneled room. Court is now in session for the case of United States versus Daniel and Helen Ellison. Hearing their names paired with United States felt like gravity itself had changed direction. The prosecutor, a woman named Clara Reynolds, stood. "Your Honor, the government calls Mara Ellison." Every step to the witness stand felt like walking a narrow beam over open water. The bailiff handed me a Bible. I didn't hesitate. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." My voice didn't shake, though everything else inside me did. Clara began gently, her tone more human than I expected. "Ms. Ellison, can you describe the events of June 14th at your grandfather's birthday party?" So I did. I told them about the slideshow, the laughter, the way the sunlight looked on the balloons right before the sirens split the air. I told them about Jake's instincts, the pill bottle, the half-signed authorization form. I told them about my father's voice saying, "Tell them it's a birthday." When I finished, the room was silent except for the scratch of pens. Clara nodded. "Did you have any prior knowledge of your parents' financial dealings regarding your grandfather's veteran accounts?" "No," I said. "I didn't know anything until that night." "And once you did?" I reported what I saw. She offered a faint, almost compassionate smile. "Thank you, Ms. Ellison." Then came the defense attorney, a man with silver hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much strategy and not enough mercy. "Ms. Ellison," he said smoothly, "you love your grandfather, correct?" "Of course." "And your husband is a former Navy SEAL?" "Yes." "So, it's fair to say you trust his judgment?" "I do." "Even when it leads you to report your own parents?" The words were designed to sting, and they did. I kept my voice steady. I trusted the truth. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Isn't it true that your husband took it upon himself to contact military police without consulting you first?" "Yes." "So, the initial accusation didn't even come from you, did it?" I blinked, realizing the trap. "No, but I agreed with it once I saw the evidence." He tilted his head. "Evidence provided by your husband. The same man trained to see threats everywhere, correct?" Jake stiffened behind me. The judge glanced up, warning. I inhaled slowly. "The same man who saved my grandfather's life," I said. For the first time, the lawyer faltered. When the questioning ended, I stepped down. Dad avoided my gaze completely. Mom's eyes, though, hers followed me, wet and pleading. When I passed her row, she whispered, "I'm sorry." I wanted to believe it, I really did. That afternoon, the prosecution presented the bank trail, wire transfers, falsified VA forms, and digital footprints leading from our family computer to the Des Moines holding account. Every line of data was a nail. When the session adjourned for the day, Jake and I walked outside into the gray drizzle. He opened his umbrella, holding it over both of us as reporters shouted questions. Was it hard to testify? Did you expect your parents to be guilty? Do you think justice will be served? I didn't answer any of them. In the parking lot, I finally exhaled. I feel like I just buried them alive. Jake folded the umbrella and pulled me close. You didn't bury them. You just stopped digging their hole for them. A week later, the verdict came down. Guilty on charges of federal fraud and unauthorized access to restricted military data. The espionage classification was dropped. No proof of intent, but the stain remained. Dad's sentencing was set for 6 years. Mom got 2 years probation and mandatory community service. When the judge read the decision, Dad didn't flinch. He just stared straight ahead, like a man counting ceiling tiles. Mom sobbed silently into a handkerchief. Afterward, Grandpa insisted on being there when we signed the paperwork transferring the house deed back to his name. He brought his old dog tags, setting them on the table beside the notary's stamp. Been carrying these for 60 years, he said quietly. Figured it's time they owned something honest again. The house was emptier when we moved him back in, like its walls had exhaled years of pretending. Dust motes floated through the sunlight as we unpacked his clothes, the old navy trunk, a box of letters tied with ribbon. This place feels different, I said. Truth does that, Grandpa replied. It strips things bare. That night, Jake and I sat on the porch, watching storm clouds roll low over the fields. The smell of wet corn and wood smoke hung in the air. Grandpa was inside, asleep in his chair, the flag folded neatly on the mantel. You did it, Jake said softly. Did what? Ended the lie. I leaned against him, exhaustion pooling in every limb. It doesn't feel like victory. It never does when it's the right thing. We sat in silence, rain ticking against the railing. From somewhere deep inside the house came the faint creak of Grandpa's chair, the sound of a man finally resting. Jake reached for my hand. They asked if I'll assist NCIS for a while, consult on other veteran identity cases. I looked up. So it's bigger than us. He nodded. Much bigger. Lightning flashed across the horizon, carving the fields into brief moments of gold. For an instant, the house looked like a photograph, old, scarred, but still standing. Inside, Grandpa stirred and muttered something in his sleep. I caught just 2 words. Truth floats. And I realized then that this wasn't the end of our story. It was the part where the tide finally turned and the things we'd buried began to rise. The weeks after the sentencing felt like living inside an echo. Everywhere I went, I could still hear the gavel, the rustle of papers, the prosecutor's measured voice saying 6 years federal. People in town stopped pretending they didn't recognize me. They'd glance over their coffee cups at the diner, whisper, then look away before I could meet their eyes. At first I hated them for it. Then I realized silence was their version of mercy. Jake tried to keep life moving forward. He sanded wood in Grandpa's old barn until the smell of cedar filled every room, the rasp of his tools steady as a heartbeat. He called it therapy, but I knew it was vigilance in disguise. Grandpa, meanwhile, was stronger every day. The sedatives had cleared from his system. His wit had returned, dry as ever. He spent mornings polishing his medals and afternoons reading old Navy journals by the window. Sometimes I'd catch him smiling at the flag on the porch, as though he could finally look at it without feeling betrayed. One evening, as I handed him his tea, he said, "They called today, the Veterans Center, asked if I'd speak at the fundraiser next month." I hesitated. "You're sure you're up for that?" He chuckled softly. "They want a reminder that honor can survive scandal. Guess I qualify." I smiled despite myself, but his words stuck with me long after I went to bed. Honor surviving scandal. Could it? Or did one always stain the other? The following week brought something unexpected. A call from an NCIS director named Simon Vega. He wanted to formally commend Jake for his role in the investigation. The ceremony, he said, would be quiet, invitation only, held at the nearest naval base. Jake tried to refuse. "I'm no hero," he muttered when he hung up. "I just saw something wrong and called it in." Grandpa overheard from his recliner. "Don't you dare decline that, son," he said. "The world's starving for people who still do the right thing without applause. You accept it, and you wear that suit like it means something." Jake smiled, defeated. "Yes, sir." 2 nights later, as rain tapped the roof, I found a voicemail on my phone with no ID. A man's voice, rough, anxious. "Tell your husband to stop talking to NCIS. He doesn't know what he's poking at." Then a click. I played it twice before Jake noticed my expression. He listened, frowning. Could be nothing, he said, though his jaw tightened. Could be Doug, I suggested. The name hung between us like a ghost. Doug had vanished after the raid. No calls, no statement, just gone. Jake forwarded the voicemail to Vega, who promised to trace it. Still, for the next few days, every truck that slowed near the house made my pulse trip, Grandpa noticed. Fear's just faith in reverse, he told me one morning. You believe the worst will happen instead of the best. Switch the direction of your belief. I wanted to, but faith felt heavier to lift than fear. The fundraiser arrived in early spring. The community hall smelled of coffee, aftershave, and fresh varnish. American flags draped from the rafters. Old soldiers filled the rows, uniforms pressed, medals gleaming like small suns. When Grandpa took the stage, the murmurs died instantly. He stood straight, hands trembling only slightly as he adjusted the microphone. I've seen the best and worst in men, he began. War taught me that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through shame. He paused, eyes sweeping the room. My family made mistakes, serious ones, but I learned that honor isn't about never falling. It's about standing back up when truth knocks you down. Applause rose, raw and genuine. I felt my throat tighten. Beside me, Jake's eyes glistened. After the speech, a retired colonel approached Grandpa and pressed a small bronze coin into his palm. For service above self, he said simply. Grandpa turned it over, smiled faintly. Didn't think I'd ever earn another one of these, he murmured. A week later came the commendation ceremony. The naval base looked almost cinematic in the afternoon sun. Gray stone buildings, flags snapping against a pale sky. Only a handful of officers attended. Jake stood tall in his dress blues, posture precise, while an admiral read the citation aloud. For exceptional civilian assistance in exposing federal fraud within veteran administration systems. When the medal was pinned to Jake's lapel, he turned and saluted Grandpa, who struggled to his feet to return it. Sir, Jake said softly, this belongs to you. Grandpa's voice broke a little. No, son. You reminded me why I ever wore that uniform. Even the officers looked moved. One wiped his eyes under the pretense of adjusting his hat. That night, the three of us sat on the porch beneath a pink-gold sky. The field smelled of lilac and earth. Grandpa turned the challenge coin between his fingers, its edge catching the last light. You know, he said, maybe the best revenge isn't punishment, it's restoration. Jake glanced at him. Restoration of what? Honor, Grandpa said simply. It's heavier than pride, but easier to carry once it's clean. I watched the sunset reflect off the metal on Jake's jacket and thought how strange it was that redemption could glow as bright as guilt ever had. The next morning brought closure wrapped in paperwork. A letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office confirmed the final sentencing. Daniel Ellison, 6 years federal. Helen Ellison, 2 years probation. Grandpa read the page twice, then folded it carefully and set it on the mantel beside the coin. Justice isn't peace, he said quietly, but it's a start. Jake nodded. Vega traced that voicemail, came from a burner registered to a former VA clerk. He's in custody now. So Doug? I asked. Not exactly. Someone who worked with him. Grandpa exhaled. Then the chains finally breaking. For the first time in months, I felt the house breathe again. Later that week, Grandpa asked Jake for one more favor. Take me to the Veterans Center, he said. There's something I need to return. When we arrived, he carried a weathered folder tied with string, the recovered Harlo documents that had nearly destroyed us. He handed them to the clerk at the front desk, a Marine vet with a limp and kind eyes. These belong to the country, Grandpa said, not to me. The clerk blinked, clearly recognizing the name on the file. Sir, you're a legend around here, he said. You helped a lot of us get our first claims processed back in the day. Grandpa smiled, weary but proud. Guess I was just doing my job. On the drive home, Jake reached across the console and brushed my hand. You think we did the right thing? He asked. I looked out at the horizon, the sky stretching wide and forgiving. I think we did the honest thing, I said. Right's harder to measure. He smiled faintly. Grandpa would approve of that answer. When we pulled into the driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically, bathing the house in soft gold. It no longer looked haunted. It looked like it had survived. A year later, Cedar Grove felt smaller, or maybe I'd just grown past the version of it that used to contain me. The scandal had faded into something people mentioned in whispers, then stopped mentioning at all. What lingered wasn't gossip. It was stillness, the kind of quiet that settles over a town once it's exhausted its appetite for tragedy. Jake and I stayed. Grandpa asked us to, though he never said it directly. He just kept saying, "This house still needs laughter in it," and we both understood what that meant. Jake turned the old barn into a small woodworking shop, sunlight cutting across his workbench every morning like a benediction. He made benches, tables, and boxes for local vets who couldn't afford much. He said he liked the rhythm of wood, that it told you where to stop cutting if you just listened. I started volunteering at the Veterans Center, helping older men and women navigate their benefits paperwork, the very system my father had corrupted. It felt poetic, in a way that hurt and healed at the same time. At first, people avoided eye contact, but over time, that changed. One day, a woman whose husband had served in Desert Storm brought me a pie. "Your grandfather helped my Frank file his first claim," she said. "He said Joe Ellison never left a soldier behind." Her eyes softened. "Neither did you." I didn't know what to say, so I just hugged her. When spring came, the tulips Mom had planted years ago bloomed again. I almost didn't recognize them, pale orange instead of pink now, but Grandpa said the soil changes color when it forgives. He still sat on the porch every morning, his dog tag swinging lightly against his chest as he watched the flag wave. Sometimes he'd hum old Navy tunes under his breath, eyes half closed, content. He was 81 that year, slower on the steps but sharper than ever in mind. Then, one April morning, I found him asleep in his recliner, sunlight on his face, a faint smile softening his mouth. The TV was still playing some old war documentary, the volume turned low. At first I thought he'd just dozed off, but the stillness was too perfect. The mug beside him was cold. His breathing had stopped somewhere between one quiet second and the next. Jake came in when he heard me crying. He knelt beside the chair, fingers on Grandpa's wrist, though we both already knew. "He went peaceful," Jake whispered, "just like he wanted." I nodded, tears falling onto Grandpa's medals, making small, shining circles on the brass. The funeral was small, just close friends, a handful of veterans, and the family that remained. Mom was there. She came quietly, escorted by her probation officer, wearing a plain black dress that looked borrowed. She didn't speak to me during the service. Only after the flag-folding ceremony, when the sailors handed me the triangle of blue and stars, did she step forward. Her eyes were red but steady. "I'm proud of you," she said. It wasn't a plea or a manipulation, just a truth she'd finally learned to say without hiding inside it. "Thank you," I whispered, and meant it. Jake and I buried Grandpa under the big oak near the edge of the property. The headstone was simple. Joseph H. Ellison, U.S. Navy, Korea, 1925-2024. Truth floats. Someone, maybe one of his old Navy friends, left a challenge coin on the stone. When the sun hit it, it gleamed like the memory of everything he'd stood for. Life didn't go back to normal after that. It just became honest. Jake's shop began to draw attention. Local news did a piece about a veteran restoring wood and dignity one table at a time. They used words like healing and redemption, but he just shrugged it off. "I'm not restoring wood," he said one night, sanding a beam smooth. "I'm restoring patience." I kept volunteering, organizing small workshops for veterans' families, teaching them how to navigate claims, prevent fraud, and keep their paperwork safe. Every time I filled out a form or explained a rule, I thought about Dad, how he could have used that same knowledge to do right. Some nights I still hated him for the choice he made. Other nights, I pitied him. Both feelings felt like family. We never saw Doug again. Last I heard, he'd taken a plea deal, traded silence for reduced sentencing. Mom finished her probation quietly, then moved 2 towns over to live with her sister. She sent one letter that summer, handwritten, neat, no excuses. It ended with a single line: "Your grandfather would be proud of the woman you became." I didn't write back, but I framed it. Not because I forgave her entirely, but because it reminded me forgiveness doesn't always need an audience. That fall, the Veterans Center held a memorial for Grandpa. They unveiled a small brass plaque near the entrance that read, "In honor of Joseph H. Ellison, who taught us that truth floats." When they asked if I wanted to say a few words, I froze. But then I saw Jake in the back of the room, arms crossed, eyes gentle, and I heard Grandpa's voice in my head. Don't let bitterness take what war couldn't. So I stood up. I used to think truth was supposed to set you free, I began. But sometimes it ruins everything first. It takes your comfort, your illusions, and leaves you with something raw but real. My grandfather understood that. He knew freedom wasn't about escaping consequences. It was about facing them. The room was quiet, full of nods and tears. When I stepped down, a man I'd never met, a retired Marine, shook my hand. Your family's story saved mine, he said simply. That night, Jake and I sat on the porch under a wide harvest moon. The air smelled of wood smoke and cold apples. He reached for my hand. You ever think about leaving this place? He asked. Sometimes, I said. But every road I imagine leads back here. He smiled. Then maybe this is home. We sat in silence for a while, watching fireflies spark over the field like tiny souls refusing to go dark. Inside the house, the clock ticked steady as a heartbeat. I looked at the framed flag above the door and thought of all the things Grandpa had carried: duty, loss, forgiveness, and how somehow he'd carried us too. Jake squeezed my hand gently. You know, he said, I used to think strength meant never breaking. Now I think it's what you build after you do. I smiled through the sting in my eyes. Grandpa would have liked that. The wind picked up, rattling the porch chimes. The sound was soft and steady, like a memory refusing to fade. When I finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. Truth floats. Jake turned to me. Yeah, he said quietly, and so does love. The moonlight washed the porch in silver. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind you earn by remembering everything and surviving anyway. And as the night deepened around us, I knew Grandpa's story, our story, would never sink again.